let's get to it. Well, welcome everybody. Really appreciate you being here. My name is Mike McLively. I'm the policy director of the GIFFORDS Center for Violence Intervention. If you're not familiar with GIFFORDS, hopefully everybody is, but if you're not, we're a national gun violence prevention organization named after Gabby Giffords, who's a former congresswoman from Arizona who was shot back in 2011 while hosting an event for her constituents. And her husband, Mark Kelly, founded GIFFORDS several years ago to hopefully end the gun violence epidemic. And we work on all aspects of gun violence, from suicide to homicide, unintentional shootings in all 50 states and at the federal level. And at the Center for Violence Intervention, we're really focused on community violence and the day-to-day shootings in our communities that are a huge driver of this epidemic. And really our mission is to get resources, funding, and infrastructure to support the work that many of you are doing on the ground. Community-based strategies for ending gun violence in our communities and working with people who are at the highest risk of being involved with violence. So welcome. This is continuing. That's our second series in a webinar that's continuing conversations from our annual conference. Hopefully many of you were able to be there in Los Angeles a few months ago, but we do this every year, the National GIFFORDS CVI Conference. We're going to be in Los Angeles again next year. We'll have more information on that coming later today. But we want to keep the conversations going in between the conference. So this is the second in our webinar series. And today we're going to be talking about state CVI coalition building. This was a hot topic at the conference a few months ago. And if you don't already know this, there's been a huge growth in the number of CVI coalitions across the country. And a few years ago, there were literally no CVI coalitions, and now there are about a dozen around the country, and many of you who are here today are part of them. So it's a really exciting time of growth for the field, and these coalitions have achieved some really remarkable results. I'm based in California, where our CalVIP coalition, and you'll hear from Gabe Garcia from that coalition, got the nation's first state tax on firearms and ammunition passed a couple years ago to fund CVI work, and that's now generating just south of $60 million a year. That's exclusively for the field in our CalVIP grant program. So coalitions are getting incredible work done. And like I said, we're seeing more and more coalitions coming online. So we have a chance today to hear from three fantastic speakers who represent coalitions in California, Illinois, North Carolina. All are doing things slightly differently. So it's a great learning opportunity or at different parts of their journey. So wherever you're at in your state, we hope this is really helpful information for you. And the last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Kim is that we've created the State CVI Coalition Alliance, the SCA, which is a national platform for anyone who does state CVI work at a coalition level to come together once a month, talk about what we're learning and our challenges, and hopefully make the whole field better together. So if you're interested in that, please let us know in the chat and we'll get you plugged in. Now I'm going to turn it over to Kim Gutierrez, who is the Associate Director of Coalitions at the GIFFORDS Center for Violence Intervention, has been in the field for many years supporting CVI work, is a fantastic colleague, and is helping build coalition strength in Illinois, where she's based in Chicago. So without further ado, Kim, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks so much. Hope everybody enjoys the webinar.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you all for being here today. As your humble moderator, I am deeply grateful for every moment you choose to spend in community with us. And all of you all that are showing up here really highlights for me the momentum in CVI advocacy and coalition building. So I want to start by grounding us in a moment that we're all still navigating. As many of you know, this year, the federal government abruptly cut over $800 million in CVI grants across the country. These cuts intervene in the stability of credible messengers and continue to threaten the very infrastructure designed to prevent shootings before they happen. What gets lost in these headlines is the truth that we all know, that before any budget line item existed, CVI leaders were already doing this work, mediating conflict, supporting families, and building the social fabric that keeps our communities safe. They did and continue to do it without certainty, without public recognition, and often without adequate resources. So when cuts of this magnitude arrive, it's not just a reduction in funding, it's a reflection of whose expertise policymakers are deeming optional. It's a dismissal of the communities carrying the heaviest burden of gun violence. It underscores why coalition building and coordinated advocacy are not add-ons to CVI work, they are essential to its survival. And that's why spaces like today matter, because here we get to make visible what the cuts attempt to muffle. We are upholding this essential, deeply human, deeply relational work, and we're strategizing about how to protect it by building power and aligning advocacy across states and by strengthening the collective voice of impacted communities. Today's topic is influenced by one of the most well-attended sessions of the Gifford CVI Conference this year, which was focused on strengthening CVI advocacy and building stronger statewide CVI coalition frameworks. To ground us even further, I want to name my North Star that I know our panelists and our audience shares in, but just to set the table, it's the belief that building power alongside communities most impacted by everyday gun violence is essential. But there's a ton of behind the scenes labor that goes into making that belief real, especially now when the field faces unprecedented disinvestment. Today, we are joined by experts who lead statewide CVI coalition efforts every day, as Mike said. And they'll take us behind the scenes to show us how strong coalitions move away from transactional exchanges and towards values-driven alignment. That kind of alignment that builds power and protects community-rooted work, even in moments of crisis. Because when coalitions activate shared values, not just our shared agendas, we don't just coordinate, we really shift systems. And so coalitions ensure community expertise is driving state policy. They build durable power that can withstand the political headwinds, and they help ensure that CVI is not treated as temporary funding, but it's an essential part of the public safety ecosystem. Before we begin, I wanted to uplift that the Gifford CVI conference that is on deck for next year, which is a wild concept to grapple with that we're already at the end of the year. But for anyone that's working in state level advocacy or coalition building, this upcoming convening will be a key opportunity to deepen alignment, strengthen strategy, and build momentum for sustainable investments in CVI. And I really hope to see many of you there. So today, I am inviting us to go deeper than acknowledging that CVI coalitions are essential, even though we've named that, right? Today, we're really asking, how is CVI coalition building work truly done? How does real support from state leaders, funders, policymakers look like? And how do coalitions not just exist, but how do they build power? The leaders that you'll hear from today have shaped this work with honesty and courage, and they will take us inside the complex labor of building trust, shaping advocacy, and transforming these very systems. So for the next 45-ish minutes, this is our space, and this is our space. I mean this by gesturing to you, the broader virtual audience as well. So plug in your reflections and your questions into the chat, and I'll do my best to uplift them throughout the conversation. But with that, I am honored to welcome Adon Bermudez Bey, the CVI organizer for community justice and North Carolinians Against Gun Violence, Gabriel Garcia, Youth Alive's policy and advocacy director, and Jack Jomarron, the policy manager at Chicago CRED, to the virtual stage. So let's get started. As I mentioned, we are all here today to dig into the behind the scenes labor of CVI coalition building and advocacy. But before we dive right in, can you share a bit more about what you do in your respective roles and in your states? I'm going to start with Adon.
Hey, Revolutionary Love. It's an honor to be here. To answer that concisely, I try to be the glue for folks. Most folks who I work with, they identify as being doing violent prevention work, and I try to help them to understand what CVI is as far as like an ecosystem and help them get to that point. But then I also sustain coalitions and try to create other coalitions as well on a more local level.
Amazing. Thanks. Gabriel?
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. As was shared, I'm the Policy and Advocacy Director for Youth Alive. We're a community-based organization in Oakland, but my position did not exist before I came on board. So the goal with creating a space for us, an organization on the ground to be involved in policy and advocacy was to do exactly what we'll be talking about today, which is make sure that frontline voices and the experiences, the expertise of community-based violence intervention programs are at the forefront of policy. So that's been my role for the past almost 6.5 years, in my time in Oakland in the field.
Thanks. Jack?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. Good morning to most, good afternoon to some. Yeah, I work at Chicago CRED as a policy manager. I've been working at Chicago CRED for about 5 years and actually started as a data analyst on our team. And so right now, my work is at a pretty cool nexus of connecting data to policy and really making sure that our elected officials across not just Cook County, where Chicago is located, but also the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois really understand the importance of CVI work, but then also making sure that on our side, right on the CVI side, that we're supporting our partners across the network in delivering the highest quality of services to our participants and to our clients.
Cool. Thank you all. I am going to go ahead and dive into our questions, and I'm going to start with you, Jack. And I'll preface this by saying that I know that a fundamental element to this work is developing what we call a shared understanding of CVI, right? And what I learned when I first moved to Chicago from CRED and MPI is that work has already happened in Illinois and continues to happen here in Chicago. So, for our audience that's not as familiar, can you talk to us about how you developed and support in the development of that in Illinois and Chicago, Jack?
Sure. Yeah. I think the best way that I can count that or recount that is looking at a history of what's happened in Chicago. So in 2016, the Communities Partnering for Peace, also known as CP4P, was formed as a coalition and basically brought around 12 to 15 organizations that do CVI work together. And they were convened under our partners, Kim, as you mentioned, MPI, Metropolitan Peace Initiatives. And so I think that really set the basis for defining CVI in Chicago, and I want to uplift the work of CP4P and MPI, because I was reading a book yesterday. They said the best form of saying is doing, and I think the way that we've really defined CVI is by doing CVI. It's been by trial and error. It's been about figuring out which pillars are really important to the work, which ones have the best research basis, the best evidence base for positively affecting individual lives and communities as well. And so that's really spun out of a lot that happened in 2016. As we move forward, and again, with that CP4P coalition, Chicago CRED works very closely with our CP4P partners. We figured out that we have to work together to get this done, right? It can't just be a CP4P solution. It can't just be a CRED solution. And so the way that we work together is really on the ground. We share data, we share stories, we share best practices. In Chicago, we've uplifted the Metropolitan Peace Academy, which standardized training across the entire CVI network within Chicago. And so by doing, we've created this definition. And I think that something that we're finding out to be more important is also having to define what CVI isn't. Because as a lot of folks on this call will be familiar with, as ARPA funds came in and a lot of folks decided that they started doing violence prevention and started doing CVI, I think we had a little bit of a diluted product. And so I think moving forward, right, we're figuring out what is CVI, but also what it isn't, and making sure that we're engaging with not just elected officials, but also the bureaucrats who drive a lot of the change and a lot of the positive work that we've seen at the state level, city level, county level, to make sure that they have an understanding and what they're looking for when grants are going out. And then finally, just collaboration really is a muscle. It's never perfect. I know, Kim, you joined us for one of our convenings, and we have tough conversations regularly. And I think the only way that you can get there is by working out that muscle. And so when you have those tough conversations on the ground, which I think everybody who's involved in CVI knows that that's the most important, you're able to have tough conversations on a policy level, on a definition level, and that's helped move us forward.
Mhm. Thanks, Jack. I feel like folks in the chat and in the virtual room could really take advantage from learning from the way that CRED and MPI continue to convene these folks. You've said a lot, but I think there's so much more to dive in there. But for the sake of time, I'm going to shift gears. I started this conversation by talking about the necessity of moving forward in collaboration with those most impacted by gun violence, and that being our shared North Star. And in CVI and coalition building work, that's really frontline voices being at the center. And so for all of you, I would love to hear how your coalitions have celebrated and sustained the leadership of credible messengers and community members in your coalitions. And I see you nodding, so I'm going to start with Adon.
Yeah, I'm nodding because it's such a big thing as someone who's a survivor as well, and have been organizing for over 10 years, and so many times I was de-escalating and working on folks to not retaliate and things like that, not knowing that I was a credible messenger or violence interrupter. And answering that question, I would say in our actual like coalition, we create a steering committee, and within that steering committee, those folks are most of those folks on the steering committee are those folks who are survivors, who are those people who are credible messengers, the community members, the leaders. And oftentimes they share, even though they're all spread out across North Carolina, they have very similar experiences where even though they have credibility in their community and they have action and even data to prove that what they're doing works, they get overlooked for some kind of like state or county-wide positions, or even if they're speaking to someone who's, let's say, works for the government or something, they're usually, you know, dismissed. And this is a concern that they have, again, all over North Carolina, Greensboro, Durham, Charlotte, Fayetteville. Many of these folks are saying the same thing. So, and as I'm in constant conversation with folks who are elected officials, who are in the government, I constantly remind them the importance of centering the voices of survivors and people who are credible messengers who are doing the work on the ground. Because, like Jack said, it is sometimes a conflict or tough work, but it's necessary work.
Thank you. I've learned from what you've said, the way that your coalition building and modeling also mirrors what you want, how you want to elevate those voices too, in ways that sometimes our frontline leaders don't see their voices and messages or messaged emulated in government or in other places in society. So thank you for elevating that. Gabe?
Yeah, I think one of the important aspects of this is recognize that we could always do better, right? As much effort as we put into elevating and giving a platform to folks on the front line and those voices, those stories, we can always do better as coalitions, as folks engaged in this advocacy work. But there's a key term that you use, which is credible messengers, and community-based organizations, frontline workers are credible messengers in the communities, the streets that they serve. My job is to make sure that that credibility translates fluently into the advocacy space, right? One way that I do that is by highlighting all of our quantitative data, showing the results of our work. But my favorite way is to actually talk to elected officials, to policymakers about the community members who created these programs, right? So I come from Youth Alive in Oakland. We've been around for over 30 years, so have a lot of privilege when it comes to talking about the origins of our programs. And one of those specific privileges for me is that I've met the folks that have created some of these models. So I start when I'm talking to elected officials by breaking down our different departments, which are prevention, intervention, and healing, so they can start to really understand what this work looks like, what it feels like, how it differs from one another. So I'll talk about our violence prevention program, and I oversee our violence prevention department. So in Oakland, we have Teens on Target. It is a high school violence prevention program started over 30 years ago by a group of high school students in the peak of violence in the wake of the crack epidemic in Oakland, who wanted to do something about all the violence that was happening around them. So they started talking to the community around what they were seeing, what they were feeling as youth surviving through this violence in Oakland. 30 years later, we continue that program. So we're still teaching high school students in the most violent neighborhoods a violence prevention curriculum, and then training them to actually teach that curriculum back to middle school students in their own words so that we can continue this intergenerational leadership development that we're doing. And some of those TNT, like the original members of TNT, have actually joined our board, and two of our staff members for that program are former TNT students. So when I'm talking about like center in the front line. It's what we do in our work, right? And that's just our prevention department. One of our claims to fame at Youth Alive is that we created the hospital-based violence intervention program model. And it was started by a young man at the time, Sherman Spears, who was shot at his mom's house. He was trying to get away from the violence. He escaped to his mom's house. He was shot there. He woke up in the hospital and found out that he would never walk again as a result of his injuries from gun violence. After going through that agony, Sherman acutely understood what gun violence survivors need in those moments in the immediate aftermath and started counseling other gun violence survivors in the hospital, inadvertently creating the first hospital-based violence intervention program. I've met Sherman. I've got to talk to him about this experience, right? But that him just doing what he knew he needed ended up being one of the most effective ways that we can address and reduce violence. And that started Youth Alive's intervention program. And I'll end by talking about our healing department, because I also like bringing in the name of the folks that we've lost, right? So one of my colleagues, Marilyn Washington Harris, started our homicide response program when her son, Gaddafi Washington, was killed over 30 years or almost 20 years ago. And after going through that experience, feeling very alone as a mother who just lost her son to homicide, she started counseling other families through that immediate aftermath of losing a loved one, creating this homicide response program. And now we continue to serve almost every single family in Oakland that loses a loved one to gun violence. And that is what CVI is, right? It's people identifying the needs that they needed, their family needed, their community needed, and filling those needs. So bringing that into the spaces by partnering with statewide, national organizations who can get me and other frontline workers into rooms that we would never otherwise be in, being able to tell those stories and make sure that, the governor, our attorney general, the speaker of our state assembly are hearing directly about these programs in detail is one of the privileges that I have, but I think it's one of the most effective things that we do in coalitions is play to our strengths, right? Because that is the credibility that Youth Alive and I can bring into any of the advocacy that we're doing.
And then just jumping off that as well, I think two things stick out for me in the city of Chicago and really the state of Illinois is I think it's paramount to invest in staff and not just in their current roles, but also in leadership opportunities, right? University of Chicago has a CVI Leadership Academy that I believe they offer spots to nationally, and I think that's a great opportunity. I previously mentioned the Metropolitan Peace Academy now has a management training program, and I think that's another opportunity for staff to receive more leadership opportunities. But then also, I think the second part, it's really important for backroom staff to make the transition for our frontline staff as easy as possible, right? Like as a policy person, I think of my colleagues who are outreach workers, case managers, victim advocates, they are policy people as well. And so then it's my job to make sure that when they're in the rooms, they're fully prepared and it's the sort of least intrusive way that we can get them into those rooms as possible, right? So they can speak to the work better than anybody else, and so my job is to make sure that they're in the room with the right people and they're armed with the data and the knowledge that they need to have those conversations as easily as possible. Because of course their main job is to be outreach workers, to be case managers, and so we want to make that as low friction as possible.
Thanks. Through all of your responses, I'm seeing the ways that your organizations and even your coalitions, you're building those leadership pipelines for those voices to be elevated. And I think that is huge. And a core part of the power of coalition building spaces that I think often gets lost, but that you all are really speaking to. Jack, I want to stay with you here for a second, and I would like to hear a bit more about the partnerships that you're building or navigating with elected officials as you are working to empower folks on the front lines with the information they need to actually educate and engage those elected officials to understand what CVI's role is in their communities. Can you talk a bit more about what that work has looked like for you?
Sure. I think the biggest way that we try to do this, and I think something that we've had some real success with, is by having an advocacy training day at the beginning of the state session, at the beginning of the city and county budget sessions as well. And basically, what that allows us to do with our partners is sort of set a basis of, hey, this is what's happening. Here's your, join this seminar for an hour, maybe an hour and a half. This is everything you need to know about the city budget coming up. And it allows us an opportunity to align with all the different organizations, the dozens of organizations that are working in CVI across Chicago. That we just implemented this year, and I think was a big success and a reason for the success that we saw at the state level. And so again, I mentioned in my first response that collaboration is a muscle, and I don't think that we could necessarily get there on day one, but the fact that we work on the ground and we have these relationships already, it's not too much to ask, hey, give me an hour of your time, let's talk policy, and then we're going to set the stage and really plan out what our, spring state budget session is going to look like. And then secondarily, I mean, the partnership with the electeds is super important. I think the way that we really engage them depends on the individual, right? You have, and I say this lovingly, you have your policy nerds. We're going to overwhelm you with data, with our research, with the efficacy of our programs, right? You have people who are really connected to stories. Hey, we have, great stories about CVI work, and we're going to make sure that we bring people into the room that can talk about their story and participants as well. And then we also like to meet elected officials where we're at, right? So it's not just about going downstate, but we'll do ride-alongs, we'll have strategic meetings. I think that's really been an opportunity that we've identified is, hey, there's some hotspot areas that elected officials will know about and we have some pretty intimate knowledge about. Let's sit down and talk about what exactly that we're going to do to try to get a hotspot tamped down at 79th and Cottage Grove. And so I think, again, it's dynamic. It has to be dynamic, but that's the job of us as backroom staff, is just to bring the people in the room who are doing this frontline work, whether it's on the elected side or it's on the organizational side, and making sure that those they have those touch points and making sure that we're working together closely.
Thanks for that. And in this moment, I also wanted to double back to something that Gabriel you mentioned, but I wanted to draw a finer point on, which is that of messaging. And Jack, you touched on this too, right? But how have you seen your coalition and in your role shape concise and adaptive messaging as the field is evolving? Obviously, we started the call talking about the federal cuts and the threats that those pose. But as political tides are shifting, funding contexts are shifting, how has your work in the coalition, in your role, shifted to adapt to that?
Was that for me, Kim? I can speak to it.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I think it's going to change depending on what state you're in, where in which phase your coalitions are in, right? Like for us in California, we spent years doing the education that Jack was talking about, like really trying to make it clear to folks in our state capital, different policymakers, what CVI is. Because for many, is a foreign concept. I'm sure there's folks on this call who are still putting together what CVI is, right, and what it's not. And it's even a debate within the field, as Jack was talking about. So doing that education, I think, is phase one, right? What we are starting to figure out is like, what is the next iteration of this advocacy look like, where we've gotten a historic investment from the state of California that is currently phasing out, but we created this permanent funding stream for community violence intervention by taxing firearms and ammunitions to make sure that 11% of the excise tax from those sales in the state of California can permanently go to community violence intervention. So what is our ask? What are we talking about to elected officials? And one of the ways that we have continued to build the momentum there is by, in the interim between those two asks, doing a thank you tour, right? Because when we got $209 million from the state, all this coalition work that we had built up over years, doing the education, meeting with elected officials, going to the state capitol year after year, suddenly we didn't have a clear ask. So by going and doing that thank you, we're actually able to circle back with elected officials. One of the most important things that they do, at least legislators, is vote. But I think for them, sometimes that vote feels like it goes off into the void and they never hear about it. They never hear the results. So just us being able to go and say, hey, this vote that you took to fund community violence intervention work, this work that you maybe barely understand, this is what we've been able to do with it, right? And actually share, I talked about the qualitative data of our storytelling, but actually come back and share and say, hey, um, our violence interrupters were able to mediate, 250 conflicts with the funding that went to Oakland. We were able to serve over 120 families who lost a loved one to gun violence. We enrolled 140 students in our high school violence prevention program, and we supported over 115 violently injured patients. Like being able to deliver that story as a community-based organization, I think helps make concrete what this vote, however risky it felt at the time, what it actually means for us on the ground, how it's actually supporting individuals who are violently impacted. But to your question on the shifting political context, I mean, Youth Alive, like many other organizations here, is one that lost a $2 million grant from the federal government and on April 22nd overnight, right? Um, and trying to message about this as our state budget is experiencing historic deficit, as is our city budget is experiencing a historic deficit. We're in a different phase of trying to maintain and claw back as opposed to build. And now we're trying to show what we've done with what we've built. I'll just end by saying that I think we are seeing public health under attack under the current federal administration as well, which is very unfortunate. But we, at the state level, are seeing a lot of great work come out of our public health departments. So, California's Commission on Behavioral Health just put out a report around the mental health impacts and intersections with gun violence. Our state Department of Public Health just put out a violence prevention roadmap that different counties throughout the state of California can look at and make sure that they are investing, supporting different strategies to address gun violence. And one of those main strategies is investing in CVI. So I think as we are seeing state and city budgets shrink, we can also identify the new partners that we could bring into this space to broaden that collaboration that Jack was talking about, to widen the voices that will be part of the choir advocating for community violence intervention to be an essential part of how we create safety.
Thanks for that, especially from hearing from where you all sit and in the budget prognosis of California, shouldering the federal impact. I hear the reliance on the infrastructure that exists and the pivoting that is necessary. I'm also curious, so I know that you all don't know this, but I started the call by joking with Adon that it feels like he's been at his role for many, many years, and Adon just started this year. But from the context that you are organizing in Adon, you're in North Carolina, which is one of the southernmost states that is active in their investments with for CVI. And so I'm curious for your take on how your coalition and your experience so far, you've had to adapt messaging or train the coalition on different messaging and how you talk about CVI to your different stakeholders.
Yeah, great question. And yeah, I learned about CVI through this position since I'm the CVI organizer for North Carolinians Against Gun Violence and Community Justice. They came together to create my position. Luckily, I was doing a lot of grassroots organizing before, so this helped me to kind of learn the language and the technical skills and things like that. But to answer your question, I think being in a very, I don't want to say conservative, but being in a southern state, there's a lot of political polarity, especially here. We're a purple state. So the thing about CVI or even violence prevention is that it used to be very, really nonpartisan. We used to see a lot of folks from both parties would support it, but recently we've seen attack for some reason. There has been an association with CVI and CRT or DEI, right? All these other acronyms. So they, as we see in the places all over the state, they have been minimizing, trying to minimize the impact of it. And what we have done, and what a lot of other folks across the state have done, was that they became more conscious of the language that they're using, so that it doesn't sound like DEI, it doesn't sound like CRT, it doesn't sound like these. We're not talking about equity, right? We're not talking about these other terms and languages that usually put up some red flags for folks who don't even understand what those words mean, honestly. So fortunately, that strategy has worked because we took away some of that language. A lot of folks have been able to receive grants. One of my favorite example is Paul. I think he was on y'all's call just a few weeks ago. Paul is in a rural area in North Carolina doing CVI work, and he's part of our coalition, and he shared with me how he lost funding. And thankfully, this is why we have our coalition, right? I was able to share some resources like the cost analysis and a few other things. And he was able, and we also were able to lobby as well. Not me personally, but another person in my organization was able to lobby and do some other work. And he was able to get his funds reinstated, right? And that's doing a really narrow tight walk, being able to talk about the work we're doing, provide a cost analysis to help people understand how much money we're saving the city, the county, or even the state. That's been really helpful, especially when, and to answer the other question, I work very closely with a lot of elected officials, a lot of folks in government all across North Carolina, and a lot of them don't. They want to support CVI, but they don't really understand what CVI is. So I constantly am having meetings and sharing this with them, but also sharing the cost analysis. I think that's been the most effective thing when I speak at city council meetings and county commissioner meetings, is providing that cost analysis that NICJR developed, where a gunshot wound is around 300,000 and a homicide is a little over 600,000. Those numbers really impact people, and it helps them to realize like we're not funding CVI or violence prevention enough, because we're literally saving a lot of money by doing this critical work.
Thanks, Adon. And you're really speaking to the different pivots and the contours of how you talk about CVI, how you define it to different stakeholders that as an organizer, you have to do. I know this, but you also have to, you're speaking to like the work that you do by training others in your coalition to do that as well. And speak to the impact of CVI, not only quantitatively, but qualitatively, and like it depends on who you're speaking to. So all of that work is work that you shoulder, and I just really appreciate you shedding an example to that, especially as you navigate the different contexts even within your state. Like the rural community is different, and so thank you for speaking to that. I wanted to touch on quickly to the subject of data sharing and coordination. You all have mentioned this in your responses, but I wanted to give it a little bit more room to breathe. And so I'm going to ask Jack specifically, how have you seen the coalition used shared data, not just for coordination across different organizations, but also how have you used it to transform your collective advocacy efforts?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. Going back to my roots as a data analyst here, I'll say before I jump into the response, I know data can be a very touchy area, right, for a lot of our CVI organizations, including my own, but others as well, right? Because we're talking about sensitive information, particularly that we track around our participants. And so the best way and maybe the easiest lift, and not that it's easy, but it's the easiest, is around coordination around which participants are in programming. And basically what that allowed us to do was to create a dashboard by community in Chicago to say how many people are Chicago CRED serving, how many people are UCAN serving, how many people are INVC serving. And with the way that we also did it is we structured it by group. And so basically the dashboard process worked as our outreach workers identified however many groups existed in a community area and how many individuals that they expected to be within that group. And then what we did was we matched our participants to those groups at Chicago CRED, at our partner organizations, and then we looked at the entire neighborhood and saw, hey, we're only reaching 20% of the individuals. Or what we saw as well was that we're only reaching 20% of the groups. And so how can we expect a neighborhood reduction in violence or a citywide reduction in violence when maybe we're going really deep with these 20% of groups, but the other 80% are receiving next to no services as it relates to CVI? And so that really helped, I think, open the eyes of our network about how much deeper that we have to go and how much broader we have to go as well, too. The expectation that we could just serve 20% of our groups and maybe go really deep with those individuals and still see reductions, I think just doesn't really hold to scrutiny. And so that's been really important for us in terms of our coordination. And as it relates to advocacy, I'm a fan, honestly, of overwhelming our elected officials with data and with research, because I think the way that elected officials go about their job, right, is they want to make sure that they're not investing in fraud. They want to make sure that they're investing in something that works. And so, and as Adon mentioned, when I can pull out a cost analysis and I can say, hey, CVI has saved 150 lives because of the research that are pulling from research that our partners at Northwestern University have done. If we get this more funding, we have a plan to serve 200 more people in Austin, which would, be a net gain of like, I will literally say all of that to an elected official. And just by hearing me drone on about data, right, they're thinking, okay, they really have their stuff sorted. And I know if I invest in CVI, that they have a plan to use it and they know what they want to use this money for. And so, again, it's still dynamic. We have to think about, who to use that with. There are some people who, again, don't appreciate maybe the numbers as much. But again, I think that the data has really helped us coordinate a little bit tighter and provide a higher quality and quantity of service to our participants. And then also really helped us with our elected official conversations, because elected officials know, hey, when CBI steps in the room, they come with a really consistent message and they come with a plan. We know if we invest in CBI, we're going to get a return on investment, not just from the cost analysis, but because they're constantly innovating it and constantly putting this money to where it needs it most.
Yeah, you spoke to those two core pieces of sharing data across organizations, across coalition members, and that being effective to scaling your impact. But then also how you transform that and tell the story and overwhelm policymakers or other supportive advocates with that data in order to turn them into champions for this work. I first also just want to appreciate the audience for including their questions in the chat. I'm going to do my best in integrating one of the questions that was asked to our panelists, but we talked a lot about the behind the scenes labor that happens within and across coalition building spaces, and I'll leave this to anyone that wants to answer. But someone asked if y'all have experience navigating best practices or in resolving conflicts within coalition spaces, especially when it comes to coalition members that maybe disagree on strategy. How do you build consensus? How do you values align in your coalitions?
To answer this one, I also responded to it in the chat. Let's speak to it a little bit more
Yeah, speak to it.
detail.
Thank you.
Yeah, so essentially, I think the first thing that's really important, we didn't have this in our coalition when I first joined, but I'm glad we had it because we went from, I don't know, 5, 10 members of our coalition across the state to, through my organizing work and mobilizing work, I was able to build it to over 150 members in our coalition. So before we got to 150, we created community agreements. And it seemed pretty juvenile, and to be honest, but the important work is that we did that, and we did that before we massively expanded. And the reason why that was so important is because we wanted to figure out how do we want to show up in the work. The coalition that I became a part of, it was one of the, I'm gonna be honest, it's the only coalition I ever been a part of where there wasn't like ego and people attacking each other and things like that. Usually in think in other coalitions I find that, but in this one, because we're all trying to create a safer community, a safer state, we're all trying to prevent violence and things like that. And there was a level of respect that we all had for each other. And but like the question said is sometimes there's disagreements that comes out around strategy. And I think that's going to always happen, especially because people have different roles. In our coalition, we have subcommittees, we have nonprofit, we have government, we have survivors, we have people in education, we have health like HVIP, we also have police, law enforcement, military. So in those 6 subcommittees, they're very different. They each have different strategies on how to come about it, doing the work. But the reality is that they have this similar outcome. They want the same goals or objectives. So sometimes it's actually best for them to have different strategies. The work that's done in the government, folks in nonprofit might not be able to do that, and vice versa. So I think it's important to hold the both and. I think sometimes we live in a dichotomous society where we feel like it has to be either or. But I want to introduce an African word called diunital. It's diunital thinking, which is that both and practice. So sometimes 2 or more strategies can actually be more effective in getting an outcome.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And I'm sure it's not easy to navigate. So I offer empathy to the person that asked the question and also all of us that navigate those on a daily basis in coalition work. But from what you shared, Adon, I really heard the values alignment is important. So creating shared agreement and norms on what we focus on and what we're here to do is really important. And then also building time for different strategies to live. So if there's a disagreement on different strategies, I heard you say there's room to work out or envision a world where both are happening, or there's like a both and approach as a best practice. So thanks for uplifting that. Does anyone else have some insight to offer?
I would just mention real quick, I think Don knocked it out of the park in terms of what I was thinking as well. The only thing that I might add would be I agree that I think differing strategies aren't necessarily, they don't undermine the coalition, but I think it's just really important to emphasize whatever strategy is pursued or if multiple strategies are pursued, it can't undermine the coalition as a large or the network as a large, right? So even if you're pursuing multiple strategies, I think a lot of times where I've seen sort of networks fall in on each other or sort of um, conflict with among these networks is when people start talking about each other or a different strategy, particularly outside of the house, so to speak, right? So we might have our disagreements internally as a network, as a coalition. We're happy to bring those to the table and have, again, really tough conversations about that. But then when we're talking to elected officials or when we're talking to folks who might not be within the house of our CVI network, we don't necessarily bring our problems to the outside world. And so I think just establishing that as a boundary and as a basis, and honestly mirroring a lot of the work that our frontline staff do, right? Like whether it's implementing a non-aggression agreement among organizations or whether you're trying to de-escalate. I think one thing that I've been really heartened about our network and about this work in general is, the principles of nonviolence, the principles of peace building. Are not just for our participants, but for us as organizations as well. And so grounding us in, as Adon mentioned, in those values and making sure that those are carried throughout are super important too.
I really appreciate that framework, Jack, about like keeping our conflicts in-house, right? Um, I think one thing that's been a real strength for our coalition is it's literally named after the fund that we're trying to support. So we have a very singular shared mission, which is increasing investment in community violence intervention. However, other organizations within that coalition want to move on different issues related to gun violence, firearm policy, health policy. That's really their business. But what we come together to do is this one shared mission, making sure the state of California is investing in community violence intervention at the highest level possible. By centering us around that shared mission, I think it has alleviated a lot of the potential for conflicts. And Adon, I'm gonna steal that word, building into my vocabulary. Diunital, thanks for sharing that. I think it's such an essential part of this approach because we're not going to agree on different issues, right? And I'll just name that with Youth Lab, I think the proximity to folks on the ground who are living through neighborhoods that are heavily impacted by violence, right? Um, I'll hear my community members talk very bluntly, very openly around like the psychological need to have a firearm in-house because they're hearing gunshots every single night, right? And it's hard to come to somebody with the data saying, actually, having a gun in your house doesn't make you more safe when it is the only thing that might give them a semblance of safety for them or their families. So we may differ on creating any punishment, any punitive policies on possession of firearms compared to some of the folks in our coalition. But ultimately, our public health approach is really focused on trying to make sure that those folks who feel that need have the opportunity, the resources to heal. And that's where we're aligned, is on CVI. So those disagreements are not necessarily a bad thing as long as we are really committed to our shared focus.
Mhm. Thanks, y'all. I'm going to uplift one more question that we're getting in the chat before I close this out, but I'm going to direct this one to Jack. Someone asked, as we're seeing drops in violence that doesn't always match the perception, how do you message about the drops in violence you are seeing in your community to make sure CVI strategies get credit, but recognize that there is more work to do?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. I appreciate it. I was typing a dissertation in the chat for that, so hopefully this will be a better version of that. I think it's a phenomenal question. It's one that, you know, we think about a lot as well too, especially in Chicago. Um, just for context, Chicago had just over 800 homicides in 2021. This year, will be at just above 400 homicides. We're down 58% in shootings. I don't know. I do know it's not a lot, especially over this holiday weekend. I don't know how many Chicagoans feel 58% safer from 2021. And as somebody who logs on every day, and as I mentioned, you know, works really closely with this data, how do we address that dissonance between safety and the feeling of safety, right? Like people are 58% safer by and large in Chicago than they were in 2021. And so I think we're thinking about that as a communication strategy. I think we need to be a little bit more aggressive in terms of our communications. And there's those among us in our coalition who think the opposite to me, but I think we need to be a little bit more positive about the work that we've been doing. But I think what's also really important, and the second part of that question is, you know, how do we make sure CVI gets the credit, but understand that we still have work yet to go? I think we have to set really aggressive goals. And I think that's something that in Chicago is maybe easier to set aggressive goals because we see regularly higher levels of gun violence than other large cities across America. And so our ultimate goal is to get under 200 homicides. And so I think we're in a communications place, right, where it's saying, hey, we're down 50% in homicides. That's phenomenal. Now we have to do it again, right? And so I think that really charges the public with, hey, this is what they're working towards. This is the goal. But it also charges our staff and it charges everybody who's involved in community violence intervention to say, takes ownership over what the next few years are going to look like and make sure that we're going to push below this, right? Because we've been close to this number that we're going to end at before. It looks like we'll be at the lowest number of homicides in 60 years, but we need to go beyond that, right? The lowest that Chicago's been in 60 years is still more dangerous than most other large cities in America. So I think setting aggressive goals and starting to poke at people's dissonance between safety and feeling safe, that's in individual conversations, but also in large communication strategies as well.
Thanks, Jack. And I thank you all for not only engaging in the chat, but to our panelists specifically for your candor and your passion that is so palpable. I would literally talk to you all for hours just about coalition work because of the endless expertise that you have to share. So I hope that our audience takes advantage of that. Thank you for letting me learn alongside you. And thank you all for spending some time with us and showing up to this webinar. My hope is that you carry these lessons and you find yourselves able to readily apply them to your CVI advocacy, especially as we face upcoming state legislative sessions, in order to help hold our states accountable to investing full scale in CVI and the safety that our communities deserve. Before we close, I mentioned this before, but please save the date for the 2026 CVI Conference, Giffords CVI Conference that's happening on July 20th and 21st in LA. This program, our program at the conference, is shaped by you. So when our call for proposals in January comes out, we really encourage you all to bring your ideas, strategies, coalition building strategies, and partnerships forward. Thank you for adding your voice to this conversation. We are so grateful for the work that you all do and look forward to staying connected. Seeing you soon. Bye.